The ground was hard beneath her feet, rough stone layered with dust, and every step she took echoed inside the vast training arena. The human stood among towering structures built for one purpose, testing strength and endurance. Around her, alien overseers watched with sharp eyes, their arms folded, their faces unreadable. To them, this was not just training, but a trial to measure if she was worthy of standing in their world. The exercises were harsh, designed to break the body and test the spirit. She lifted heavy stones, ran across uneven paths, and climbed tall walls, all while the air pressed down on her chest like weight she could not shake. Yet she moved forward with determination, her every step showing she would not give in to weakness. The other trainees, both human and alien, watched from the sidelines. Some looked on with curiosity, others with quiet doubt, wondering how long she could last under such pressure. Among the crowd sat the cubs, small yet intelligent creatures, their sharp eyes fixed on her. They had grown used to her presence, watching her train day after day, and though they were young, they understood effort and struggle. They did not laugh or whisper like some of the others. Instead, they sat quietly, their tails flicking with unease whenever she stumbled. They studied the way she pushed herself, how she stood tall even when her shoulders shook with exhaustion. To them, she was more than a stranger in the arena. She was someone who carried a strength different from claws or fangs, a strength that came from refusing to stop. The overseers barked new orders, making the drills even harder. Sweat ran down her face, her breath sharp and uneven, but she kept moving. Each task felt heavier than the last, but she did not allow her legs to give way. Every moment was a test, not only of her body, but also of her dignity. She knew the overseers wanted to see her break, to watch her fall, but she would not grant them that satisfaction. The cubs could sense her struggle, their ears twitching as they leaned closer. And though they did not speak, their gaze carried silent encouragement. The arena was filled with noise, the crash of stones, the grunts of effort, the harsh commands of the overseers, but within that chaos, a quiet bond formed between the human and the cubs who watched her. They learned not only about strength, but about willpower, about the silent fire that made her rise each time she could have fallen. Though the overseers thought they were shaping her, they did not realize something greater was happening. The cubs were learning from her, and their eyes shone with respect. She was not just surviving the training ground, she was teaching without words, proving that real power was not only in the body, but also in the heart that refused to give up. The exercise had already pushed her to the edge. The human had been climbing a tall structure made of stone and steel, her arms trembling from the strain, her breath heavy from the endless drills. Every pull, every step upward felt like dragging her body through fire. The overseers stood at the edges of the ground, their gazes cold and sharp, as though they were waiting, almost hoping, for her to falter. Around her, other trainees looked on, some whispering, some smirking, some silently admiring her effort, but too afraid to say it aloud. Then it happened. A sudden sound, sharp but soft enough that only those closest caught it, the rip of fabric. Her uniform tore. It wasn't a full collapse of clothing, just a tear across the side where the strain of movement had been too much. Yet in that single instant, everything seemed to freeze. The sound of stone being struck, the echo of boots against the ground, even the steady breaths of those training nearby, all seemed to vanish. Her heart sank. It was not pain that stopped her for a moment, but something far sharper: humiliation. She knew the eyes of the overseers, the other trainees, and even the watching cubs were on her now. It was not just a uniform tearing. It was dignity being tested in the cruelest way. For a heartbeat, she thought of stopping, of covering herself, of turning away from the wall she was climbing. That would have been the easy path. But something inside her refused to let her fold. Her hand tightened against the stone, her jaw clenched, and she forced herself to keep climbing. If she faltered now, the moment would not just be remembered as a uniform tearing, it would be remembered as her defeat. The overseers exchanged small glances, as if amused by what had just happened, though they said nothing. Their silence was its own kind of cruelty, leaving the humiliation to echo in her chest. Some of the other trainees tried to hide their laughter, but the sound of it carried. She felt each chuckle like a stone thrown her way. Yet above all, she could feel the weight of the cubs' gaze. They were not laughing. Their eyes held confusion, worry, and something close to sadness. The human pressed forward, her body trembling, her face set with grim determination. Every step now was not only against the weight of the climb, but against the shame trying to crush her. She reached the top of the wall, standing tall for a moment, her torn uniform visible for all to see. She did not cover it, did not bow her head. Instead, she stood as though nothing had broken, as though her strength mattered more than the strip of cloth that had failed her. Down below, the cubs leaned forward, their small bodies tense. They did not understand everything about uniforms or shame, but they understood her struggle. Something stirred inside them as they watched, a protective instinct they could not yet name. What seemed like a moment of humiliation to many became, for them, a moment of silent loyalty. They did not see weakness in her torn clothing. They saw the courage it took to keep climbing when the world wanted her to fall. The human's hand still gripped the rough stone, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths as she climbed down. She knew the tear was visible. She could feel the cool air brushing against the gap in her uniform, reminding her with every step that her mistake was on display. But she forced herself to move as if nothing had happened. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Down below, the crowd had already noticed. Trainees whispered behind cupped hands, their voices low but sharp, carrying across the training ground. Some smirked openly, their eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. For them, it was not about the torn cloth, but about the chance to see her stumble, to see the one human among them lose the dignity she fought so hard to protect. They had always been told she was weaker, that she did not belong, and this moment gave them proof they could cling to. The guards were no kinder. Their sharp eyes followed her, some with raised brows, others with faint grins tugging at their lips. They did not laugh, not openly. They were too disciplined for that. But their silence carried a heavy mockery. It was the silence of those who believed themselves superior, watching to see how long she could carry her shame before crumbling. Every whisper grew louder in her mind. She could almost hear the words even without catching them all. Weak, fragile, broken. Her heart hammered, not from the climb, but from the weight of humiliation pressing against her ribs. Yet even with her body screaming for rest, she forced herself to stand tall when she reached the ground. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked straight ahead. For a moment, the whispers dimmed. Not because the crowd respected her, but because they were waiting for her to flinch, waiting for her to tug at the torn fabric, to cover herself, to prove their unspoken belief that she was too human, too vulnerable, too out of place. The cubs stood close to the edges, their round eyes wide, watching in silence. They did not laugh, nor did they whisper. They only stared, their small bodies still, their ears tilted forward. Where others saw weakness, the cubs seemed to sense something else, something deeper. They saw the way her hands did not tremble, the way her eyes refused to drop to the ground, the way her shoulders carried the weight of shame without bending. The human's gaze swept across the crowd, meeting eyes without fear. She felt the sting of their stares, but she did not let it show. Inside, her chest ached with the rawness of being exposed, but outwardly, she stood unbroken. If they wanted to laugh, let them laugh. She would not give them tears. The moment stretched, heavy and unyielding. A silence fell again, the kind that lingers when something unspoken presses on everyone at once. For the crowd, it was the silence of waiting for her collapse. But for the cubs, it was the silence before a choice, an instinct awakening, urging them to do more than watch. The human drew in a shaky breath, forcing her legs to keep moving. Every muscle ached, every step felt heavier than the last, yet she pushed herself forward. The tear in her uniform still tugged at her thoughts like a wound she could not hide. She wanted to forget it, to believe it didn't matter, but in the Empire's eyes, such a flaw was never overlooked. Weakness here was not just punished, it was remembered. She lifted a weight from the ground, her arms straining as she raised it overhead. The stone was rough against her palms, scraping her skin, but she did not flinch. She had learned long ago that pain was not her enemy. It was hesitation, doubt, and shame that could destroy her. Still, as she stood there under the gaze of hundreds of eyes, she felt the sting of humiliation burn hotter than any wound. She knew the rules of this place. In the Empire, shame was as dangerous as defeat. A stumble could be forgiven if it came with strength, but visible vulnerability was a scar that never faded. They would not forget this moment. They would carry it like a weapon, ready to remind her whenever she dared to rise too high. Her heart sank with the weight of that truth, but she refused to let her body betray her. She dropped the weight and moved to the next task, climbing again, running again, pushing herself harder than before. Each motion was defiance, each movement a declaration that she would not yield. But inside she carried the heavy ache of knowing her dignity had already been torn along with the cloth of her uniform. Around her, the whispers had not stopped. Some voices were mocking, sharp and cruel, while others were filled with quiet pity. The guards, unmoving as statues, kept their eyes on her, their cold gazes pressing down like iron chains. She could almost feel them waiting for her to collapse, eager for proof that she did not belong among them. But then, in the corner of her vision, she caught sight of the cubs. They stood at the edge of the training ground, their eyes fixed on her with something different, something she had not seen in the faces of the others. There was no mockery in their gaze, no pity, only a quiet, fierce kind of loyalty. They seemed to understand her struggle in a way no one else could, as if they felt the weight of her humiliation pressing down on them too. Her heart steadied for a moment at that sight. The shame did not vanish, but the strength to keep moving burned a little brighter. She was not sure if she could endure much longer, but she knew one thing. She would not give the Empire what it wanted. They wanted her broken, bowed, and humiliated. Instead, she would leave them with the image of a human who refused to fall. And though she did not yet know it, the cubs watching her so closely were already carrying the spark of what would come next, a spark born not from mockery or cruelty, but from instinct and devotion that even the Empire could not command. The cubs stood at the edge of the training ground, their small bodies pressed close together, watching every move of the human. They had always watched her, not just out of curiosity, but out of something deeper. From the very first day, they had seen the way she treated them, not as tools or burdens, but as living beings with feelings, worth, and spirit. While others barked orders and showed indifference, she had offered kindness. She had shared her food when she had little for herself, shielded them when punishment fell unfairly, and spoken to them as though their hearts mattered. So now, as her steps faltered and the tear in her uniform left her vulnerable, the cubs could not simply stand by. Their bright eyes followed the tremble in her hands, the exhaustion heavy in her movements, and the quiet shame that hung over her like a shadow. To them, this was not just a torn cloth, it was a wound to her pride, something that the mocking whispers and cruel stares would only deepen. They understood in their own way, young though they were, that this moment carried danger. One cub gave a soft whine, nudging the shoulder of another. The sound was low, almost uncertain, but it carried the weight of an idea. The others turned, their eyes shining with a shared concern. They did not need words. Their bond, forged in long days of watching, listening, and quietly learning from her example, spoke louder than anything they could say. Their heads lifted, ears twitching as they looked around the ground. Scraps of cloth and discarded fabric used in training lay nearby, torn and forgotten by others. To the cubs, these were not worthless rags. They were answers. Small paws touched the ground, claws scraping lightly as they moved together, a silent decision forming between them. The human, though focused on finishing her task, felt the weight of their eyes on her. She glanced briefly toward them, and for a moment, the shame that had been eating at her eased just slightly. The cubs did not laugh, did not look away. They only looked at her with a kind of glowing concern she had never seen from anyone else here. That glance was enough to spark something within her. Even in the depths of her distress, she realized she was not completely alone. And the cubs, sensing that faint spark of connection, grew braver. They nudged each other again, their small bodies tense with determination. They had seen her courage countless times. They had watched her endure punishment, hunger, and pain without breaking. They had seen her stand tall even when others tried to make her bow. Now it was their turn, though they were small, to return what she had given them. In their hearts, the choice was simple. They could not fight the overseers. They could not silence the laughter of guards or trainees, but they could protect her dignity in the only way they knew. So together, with a shared glance and a flicker of loyalty burning in their eyes, the cubs prepared to act. The ground was filled with the heavy rhythm of training, shouts from overseers, and the metallic clank of weapons striking against stone. Yet through all of that noise, something unexpected began to happen. From the edge of the field, small shapes emerged, shapes that no one had paid attention to a moment ago. The cubs, at first no one noticed. They moved quietly, each one with its head lowered, small jaws gripping pieces of torn fabric and discarded cloth. These were scraps the others had seen as worthless, frayed edges from old uniforms, strips pulled loose from training dummies, and even pieces they had saved from their own bedding. To the cubs, however, these scraps were not useless. They were treasures, carefully gathered for this very moment. The first cub trotted forward, the strip hanging from its mouth dragging across the dirt. Its small body trembled with nerves, but its eyes glowed with purpose. Behind it came another, and then another. Soon a line of them appeared, each carrying something, each determined. One by one, they stepped into the open space where the human stood, still trying to finish her task despite the tear in her uniform. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The guards frowned, confused. The other trainees stopped what they were doing, their smirks fading into stunned silence. No one could make sense of what they were seeing. Why would the cubs do this? Why would they leave their place of safety and risk drawing the overseer's anger just to carry scraps of cloth? The human froze mid-movement as she saw them. Her chest tightened, her throat dry. For a moment she thought it was a dream, some vision brought on by her exhaustion. But then one cub stopped at her feet and dropped the cloth gently, nudging it closer with its nose. Another followed, placing its strip beside the first. Soon the ground in front of her was scattered with the pieces they had carried. Each one delivered with loyalty too pure to mistake. Her hands shook as she bent down, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric. The simple gesture pierced deeper than any word could. It was not just kindness. It was recognition, an unspoken promise that she was not alone in her struggle. The overseers shouted from the edges, their voices sharp with disapproval. Yet even their commands seemed weaker than before, drowned out by the quiet bravery of the cubs' actions. Small bodies stood proudly, tails swaying with determination, eyes never leaving the human they had chosen to protect. The hall that once felt heavy with humiliation now felt different. The mocking whispers had died. The air had shifted. What was once weakness had been turned into something else entirely, a quiet defiance. Born not from strength of arms, but from the loyalty of those too small to fight, yet too brave to stay silent. And as the human tied the cloth strips across the tear in her uniform, her heart no longer sank with shame. Instead, it rose with something she had nearly lost, dignity, and a bond stronger than the chains of fear. The human stood frozen, her breath uneven as the cubs circled closer. Their paws left small prints in the dust of the training ground, their movements steady but gentle, carrying a weight far greater than their size. One of them nudged its cloth strip against her leg, not clumsy, but careful, as if it understood exactly what needed to be done. Another stepped forward, pressing a piece of fabric into the tear of her uniform. The others followed, each taking turns, their small paws brushing the cloth into place, holding it there with a strange patience. It wasn't just a simple act. It was a shield, an effort to cover what others had seen as weakness, turning it into something whole again. Their little bodies leaned against her, tails flicking, eyes glowing with loyalty that no overseer could order and no soldier could fake. They did not see shame in her torn uniform. They only saw someone they cared for, someone who had once shown them kindness when no one else would. Now, in front of guards and fellow trainees, They returned that kindness in the only way they knew. Around them, the air shifted. The whispers that had once carried mockery now fell silent. The smirks faded from faces, replaced with disbelief, even unease. To cover another's weakness was not something the Empire taught. In the Overseer's world, weakness was exposed, ridiculed, and punished. But here were the Cubs, openly defying that cruel rule without even realizing it. They pressed the cloth firmly into her uniform, as though they could block not only the tear, but also the harsh eyes of those watching. The human's throat tightened. Her knees nearly buckled, not from exhaustion this time, but from the wave of emotion rising inside her. She felt their warmth, their faith in her, and something inside her heart shifted. She had walked into this training ground prepared to endure humiliation, knowing that even a small failure could be used against her. Yet now, with the Cubs by her side, she felt something unexpected. She felt protected. The guards barked orders, their voices sharp, telling the Cubs to back away. But the young ones didn't move. They pressed closer, forming a barrier of fur and determination, their paws still steady against the cloth, their eyes fierce despite their size. It was a protective gesture so simple, yet so powerful, that it silenced the harshest words before they could be spoken. The human placed her hand gently over one of the Cubs' paws, her fingers trembling. No speech was needed. This act had spoken louder than any words. The shame she feared was gone, replaced by a dignity no overseer could strip away. And as the training ground watched in silence, it became clear to all, loyalty, even in its smallest form, could break the strongest chains of fear. The training ground, once filled with harsh commands and sharp whispers, now sank into an uneasy quiet. The sound of the Cubs' paws shifting against the dirt was louder than the voices of soldiers and overseers who usually ruled the arena with noise and authority. No one dared to laugh anymore. The moment, though small in action, felt too heavy to be mocked. The overseers stood frozen, their eyes narrowing as they watched the Cubs press the cloth to the human's torn uniform. They had expected weakness to break her spirit. They had expected the crowd to jeer and use her shame as proof that humans were not fit for the trials. Instead, they witnessed an act so pure, so unplanned, that it tore apart the very silence they relied upon for control. The Cubs had not been ordered. They had not been trained. They had simply acted out of care, and in that care, there was defiance. The other trainees shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their gazes, ashamed of how they had once waited for her downfall. Others glanced at the Cubs with something close to respect, realizing that dignity did not come from victory or strength, but from loyalty and compassion. A few clenched their fists, unsure if they felt threatened by what they saw or inspired by it. The human stood still among them, her body weary but her spirit strangely lifted. She had prepared for ridicule, braced herself for punishment. But this silence felt different. It was not the silence of fear or failure. It was the silence that follows when truth enters a room, when something so genuine cuts through layers of cruelty and pride. She felt the Cubs pressing against her legs, their warmth steady, their eyes glowing with trust. And for the first time, she no longer felt alone on the training ground. The overseers exchanged glances, their authority shaken. This was not a rebellion, not in the way they understood it. It was worse. It was something that could not be silenced by chains or punishments. A laugh could be punished, a word could be twisted, but this innocent act of covering her with cloth was untouchable. It was pure. It was truth. One overseer cleared his throat trying to bark a command, but his voice faltered in the stillness. The sound of it felt weak compared to the unspoken message hanging in the air. The Cubs had spoken without words. The human's dignity had been defended without a fight, and all who watched knew they had seen something the Empire could not control. The silence stretched on, growing heavier by the moment. It was not emptiness. It was a silence full of meaning, a silence that demanded reflection. No speech from the human could have carried such weight. No victory in training could have left such an impression. What the Cubs had done had already become more powerful than any display of strength. And deep inside, the human realized it too. She had not needed to prove herself with unbroken endurance or perfect skill. She had already proven something far greater. that bonds built on loyalty could stand taller than any wall of fear the Empire could create. Her chest rose and fell as she tried to steady her breathing. The ache in her muscles was sharp, the dirt clung to her skin, and the rip in her uniform still pressed against her thoughts. But none of that mattered now. Her eyes burned, not from the dust in the air, but from the weight of emotion pressing behind them. She felt the sting of tears, though she fought to hold them back. She could not show weakness, not here, not before the eyes of those waiting for her to fail. And yet this time the tears were different. They were not born of shame, but of something she had not expected in this place: kindness. The cubs had given her more than cloth. They had given her the strength to rise again. Their small faces tilted up toward her, their eyes glowing with a simple trust that asked for nothing in return. She blinked hard, drawing in a deep breath, and forced her body upright once more. With the strips of cloth pressed against her torn uniform, she stepped back into the drill. The overseers barked commands again, sharp and merciless, as if trying to pretend the silence had never happened. But she no longer heard them as threats. Every movement she made now carried a new kind of power. Her arms swung, her legs pushed against the ground, and each strike of her body into the exercises felt steadier than before. The weight she had been carrying, the fear of ridicule, the shadow of failure, lifted with every step. She was not alone anymore. That thought echoed in her heart as clearly as the overseers' voices echoed in the arena. She had always walked into training expecting to be surrounded by enemies, by rivals eager to see her stumble. But now, when she glanced to the side, she saw the cubs watching closely, their small bodies alert, as if every movement she made was theirs too. She was no longer carrying her burden by herself. They carried it with her, in their own way. The other trainees noticed. They saw the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes and the determined way she refused to let them fall. They saw how her back straightened, how her movements sharpened, how her spirit seemed to burn brighter instead of dimming. Some felt uneasy, realizing that what should have been humiliation had transformed into strength. Others felt a quiet respect growing within them, though none dared to admit it aloud. As the drills dragged on, her body screamed with fatigue, but her heart no longer wavered. Each step forward was a silent vow, to honor the cubs' trust, to rise above shame, and to show that compassion could be stronger than cruelty. When the set of exercises finally ended, she stood taller than before, breathing hard but unbroken. The cubs padded closer, brushing against her legs, their simple presence wrapping around her like armor no overseer could strip away. She looked at them, and though her lips did not form the words, her heart spoke them clearly. "Thank you." The gratitude stayed with her, deep and steady, giving her the courage to face whatever came next. Long after the dust of training settled, the story did not fade. What had seemed like a small moment, a torn uniform and a few strips of cloth, became something far greater. The Cubs' act, simple and pure, traveled faster than any order the overseers could give. Whispers carried it from one trainee to another, until it passed beyond the walls of the training ground and into the hearts of many. They spoke of how the human did not break under humiliation, even when eyes watched for her downfall. They spoke of how the cubs, too young and too small to fight with weapons, had still fought in their own way, by protecting her dignity when no one else dared. What should have been a forgettable accident turned into something unforgettable, a moment where loyalty triumphed over cruelty. Trainees repeated it in hushed tones during meals, their voices low but their eyes alive with wonder. Some added small details, saying the cubs' eyes glowed with fire, or that the silence in the arena was so heavy it could be felt in the bones. Each retelling made the story stronger, carrying it further, shaping it into something larger than life. The overseers frowned at the spreading talk, but even they could not stop it. To many, it was not about the cloth itself, but about what it represented. The cubs had reminded everyone that strength was not only about muscle or endurance. Strength could also be found in care, in refusing to let someone stand alone in shame. The Empire valued dominance and fear, yet this quiet act of devotion shook that belief. It planted questions in the minds of those who had seen it. What if unity, not control, was the true power? For the human, the story became a shadow and a light at once. Wherever she walked, eyes followed her, not with mockery anymore, but with a strange respect. Some who had once smirked now lowered their gazes when she passed. Others nodded faintly, as if saluting her without words. She had not asked for it, yet she had become a symbol of something beyond herself. The cubs, of course, did not understand the weight of what they had done. To them, it was simple. They saw someone they cared for in pain and moved to help. But perhaps that was why their act carried such power. It had been done without thought of reward, without fear, without calculation. It was loyalty in its purest form, and purity has a way of echoing louder than anything forced. And so the memory grew. It became a tale told not just within the training grounds, but whispered across the barracks, the mess halls, and even the cities where word of mouth could not be controlled. A torn uniform had become a legend, and the bond between one human and a group of cubs had become a story stronger than steel, carried forward by every voice that chose to remember.